Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the weather like where you are tonight? And do you have a little evening ritual that helps you unwind? Share it with us. I truly enjoy reading your comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. A Warning in the Wind. The village of Loughdoob had a particular way of knowing when the weather intended mischief. It was not a matter of consulting forecasts on the radio or peering at barometers nailed to the walls of damp front hallways, though both of these activities were practiced with great devotion by residents who then largely ignored what they learned. It was, rather, a collective feeling in the bones, the kind of ancestral Highland wisdom that had kept fishermen alive for centuries and had, on more than one occasion, kept Hamish Macbeth from getting his good uniform jacket soaked through. On this particular Tuesday in October, every bone in Loughdoob was speaking loudly, and none of them had pleasant things to say. Hamish Macbeth, constable of the village, and, as he frequently reminded his superiors in Strathbane, perfectly satisfied to remain so, stood in the doorway of the Loughdoob police station and looked out at the loch. The water had turned the colour of pewter sometime round noon, and since then it had been darkening steadily toward a shade that Hamish could only describe as grim. The mountains to the west had swallowed their own tops in heavy cloud, and the wind, which had been merely irritating all morning, was now developing genuine opinions about the matter. Beside him, his great grey dog Lug sat with the air of a philosopher, contemplating the futility of all things. Lugs had enormous ears, a lopsided way of looking at the world that had always struck Hamish as deeply sensible, and a talent for reading weather that put the meteorological office to shame. The dog had not moved from the doorway in 2 hours, which Hamish took as confirmation that the forecast was every bit as dire as the BBC had been insisting. The BBC had been using words like severe and Atlantic depression and gusts of up to 70 miles per hour, which in a Highland village translated simply to stay indoors, tie down anything you valued, and do not, under any circumstances, attempt to drive the Glen Road after 9 o'clock. Hamish had already done a loop of the village in the Land Rover, making the sort of vague, reassuring noises that were expected of him. He had reminded old Archie MacLean to secure his boat. He had suggested to Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, that perhaps her garden furniture might benefit from being brought inside, an observation she received with the expression of a woman who did not require instruction from the likes of Hamish Macbeth. Thank you very much. He had checked in on the Napiers up on the hill, and he had noted, with the mild professional interest that was as close as he generally came to alarm, that the lighthouse on the headland to the north had been flickering. The Rudder Moor Lighthouse was maintained by the Northern Lighthouse Board, and was the sort of structure that was supposed to work reliably, regardless of what the weather was doing. It was, after all, most urgently needed in precisely the conditions now rolling in from the Atlantic. To see its beams stuttering and uncertain, like a man trying to remember the words to a song he had known perfectly well an hour ago, was not comforting. Hamish had made a note to telephone about it. In Loughdoob, making a note to telephone about things was often the opening chapter of a long and frustrating story, but it was the correct procedure, and Hamish was, in his unhurried way, a great respecter of correct procedure. He turned from the door, put the kettle on, and scratched Lugs behind one vast ear. The dog leaned into his hand with an expression of pure gratitude that Hamish found, as always, deeply cheering. It was as he was settling in with his tea that Willie Lamont appeared, breathless and pink-cheeked, to inform him that the Loughdoob Hotel was filling up with strangers. This was not in itself unusual. The hotel, run by Mr. Johnson with a combination of Highland hospitality and profound suspicion of anyone from south of Inverness, occasionally attracted guests with no obvious reason for being in Loughdoob. Anglers came in spring, walkers came in summer, and the occasional lost tourist appeared at any time of year, with the expression of someone who had been following a sat-nav and now deeply regretted it. But Willie, who cleaned the police station with what Hamish privately considered excessive enthusiasm, and who had an instinct for news that would have served him well on Fleet Street, said that this particular collection of strangers had an unusual quality about them. They were all arrived separately, like, Willie said, accepting tea without being offered it, and none of them looks as if they came to walk or fish. There's a man in a very good suit who keeps checking his phone and looks like he's annoyed at everything, and a woman with a notebook who keeps writing things down, and this older man looks like a fisherman Sitting in the corner drinking steadily and not saying much, Hamish considered this. It's a hotel, Willie. People are allowed to stay in it. Aye, but there's also a young woman who keeps looking out the window like she's expecting something terrible, and a man in a waterproof jacket who said he was a marine biologist, which you don't often get. Hamish had to concede that marine biologists were, indeed, infrequent visitors to Loch. He pulled on his jacket, told Lugs to stay, and walked up to the hotel through a wind that was now making its intentions entirely plain. The Loch Hotel was a long, low building that had been added to irregularly over several decades, and had consequently achieved the architectural character of a sentence that had been revised too many times. Inside, a fire was burning in the main lounge with the kind of aggression that suggested even the fireplace was aware of what was coming, and the mixed group that Willie had described was arranged around it in the careful way of people who did not know each other, and were not yet certain they wished to. Hamish clocked them with the easy, unhurried observation that was, along with his lanky height and his uncommonly red hair, one of his most notable characteristics. The man in the good suit was Gregor Sinclair, as Mr. Johnson murmured quietly at Hamish's elbow, a developer, down from Edinburgh interested in coastal land. He had the manner of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and expressed displeasure at any delay in this process by becoming louder. He was currently being loud at a dark-haired woman in her 30s who had introduced herself as Morag Kerr, a local environmental activist who had the expression of someone who had been preparing for exactly this conversation for quite some time. Sitting apart from the argument with the deliberate peace of a man choosing not to hear it was Angus MacLeod, who had the look of someone who had once gone to sea and still carried it in his posture. Across from him, a sharp-featured woman named Fiona Drummond was writing steadily in a notebook, glancing up at Gregor Sinclair with the focused attention of a naturalist, observing a particularly interesting specimen. Near the window, just as Willie had described, was a young woman with fair hair who gave her name as Clara Bell and claimed to be writing a novel. She was watching the darkening loch with an expression that had, Hamish thought, very little to do with artistic inspiration. Beside the fireplace, Dr. Ewan Fraser, the marine biologist, sat with a glass of whisky and said very little, but watched everything with eyes that catalogued and filed and gave nothing away. And then there was Donald Ross. Donald was the acting lighthouse keeper, a gaunt man of 50 or so, who had been working the Rooder Moor Light for the Northern Lighthouse Board on a temporary basis, while the permanent keeper was on medical leave. He sat at the far end of the lounge nursing a pint, and when Hamish caught his eye, he looked away with the speed of someone who would have preferred not to be noticed. Hamish found this interesting. He was still finding it interesting when Gregor Sinclair rose to his feet and announced, to the room in general and to Morag Kerr in particular, that this country was being strangled by people who cared more about birds and seaweed than about progress, and that he had not driven 300 miles to be lectured by amateurs. The room went quiet in that particular Highland way that was not peace but the weather before a storm. Outside, the wind hit the windows hard, and somewhere in the darkness above the village, the lighthouse beam flickered twice and then, briefly, steadied. Hamish Macbeth sipped the tea Mr. Johnson had pressed upon him and said nothing at all. He was, as his mother had often told him, a great one for patience, and patience, he had found, was very often how the truth eventually arrived. Chapter 2. Shadows Before the Storm. By 7 o'clock that evening the storm had stopped making threats and started making good on them. The wind came in off the Atlantic with a kind of personal grievance, rattling the hotel windows in their frames and sending the sign above the front door into a rhythmic banging that Mr. Johnson said he would fix and had been saying he would fix for 3 years. The loch was invisible now beyond a wall of rain and darkness. The fishing boats were tugging at their moorings with the anxious insistence of dogs who scent something wrong. Power had flickered twice along the village's single main street, and the second time it had taken 4 minutes to come back, which in Loch was long enough to cause comment. Inside the hotel, the fire had been built up to something approaching heroic proportions, and the group that circumstances and the deteriorating weather had assembled there had settled, with varying degrees of grace, into the enforced intimacy of people who could not reasonably go anywhere else. Hamish had not gone home. He told himself that this was ordinary prudence. As the village constable, it was entirely appropriate to remain where he could be of use should the storm produce the kind of incident that required a police presence. A fallen tree across the road, perhaps, or a boat that had slipped its mooring. These were legitimate concerns, and he held them in mind with the comfortable awareness that they were not the real reason he had ordered a second cup of tea, and settled himself into the chair nearest the fire with a view of the entire room. The real reason was that something about the assembled company was bothering him, in the quiet, persistent way that a dripping tap bothers a man trying to read. He watched Fiona Drummond first because she was the easiest to watch. She had the professional invisibility of someone who had spent years making people forget they were being observed, and she deployed it with considerable skill, but not quite enough to fool Hamish. She had positioned herself where she could see both the door and Gregor Sinclair simultaneously. Whenever Gregor spoke, which was often and at length, her pen moved. Whenever he laughed, which was rarely and unpleasantly, her expression did something careful and controlled before settling back into mild attention. She was not, Hamish was fairly certain, writing a piece about the scenic qualities of the Sutherland coastline. Her interest in Gregor Sinclair's business dealings had the specific quality of someone who already knew a great deal and was waiting for the moment to know more. Gregor himself had recalibrated his approach to the evening after his earlier clash with Morag. He was now performing the role of the affable, misunderstood entrepreneur, which he did with the conviction of a man who had practiced it in mirrors. He bought a round of drinks which nobody had asked for, and told a long story about a development project in Fife that had been, by his account, a triumph of vision over obstruction. Angus MacLeod, accepting the drink with the neutral courtesy of someone who had not asked for it, and had no intention of being grateful, stared into the fire throughout and said nothing. Hamish knew Angus slightly, in the way that Lochdew people knew most people within a 40-mile radius, which was to say, not well enough to predict him, but well enough to read him. Angus had retired from fishing some years ago after a run of losses that people mentioned vaguely and didn't specify. He had the stillness of a man who had made his peace with disappointment through sheer stubbornness, and the particular kind of silence that was not emptiness, but accumulated thought. He had listened to Gregor's story about the Fife development, with an expression that was entirely blank, which in Hamish's experience was more informative than most expressions. Clara Bell was less easy to read, because Clara Bell was working hard to be easy to read. She had arranged herself as a novelist on holiday should, a battered paperback open in her lap, a glass of wine to hand, an expression of mild, unthreatened interest in her surroundings. She asked Angus polite questions about the village, and made small charmed noises at his answers. She laughed at one of Gregor's jokes, which required genuine effort. She mentioned twice that she was planning to drive up to Caithness later in the week for research purposes. All of it was entirely convincing, and the fact that it was entirely convincing was what made Hamish uneasy. Real novelists on research holidays did not, in his experience, work quite so hard at looking like novelists on research holidays. They simply were, untidily and without effort. Clara Bell's performance was too composed. Her posture at the window earlier, watching the loch with that particular expression, had contained something he recognised without being able to name. Not fear exactly, but the braced stillness of someone who already knew the bad news was coming and was simply waiting to find out its shape. Across the room, Dr. Fraser finished his whisky and ordered another with the unhurried ease of a man who felt entirely comfortable in his surroundings, which was interesting because he had, by his own account, arrived in Lochdew only that afternoon to study unusual shoreline activity along the headland. He ought, by rights, to be slightly at sea in a strange village hotel on a stormy evening, the way visiting academics generally were. Dr. Fraser was not. He sat with one ankle crossed over his knee and watched the room with intelligent, measuring eyes, and occasionally smiled at things that hadn't been said. Hamish went to find Donald Ross. Donald had quietly migrated to the far end of the bar sometime in the previous half hour, which put him around a corner from the main lounge and technically in a different room. He was on his third pint, and the way he was drinking it suggested he was treating alcohol as a professional tool rather than a pleasure. "Lighthouse still playing up?" Hamish asked, sitting down on the adjacent stool with the unhurried air of a man with nowhere better to be. Donald's jaw tightened slightly. "It'll sort itself. These things happen in bad weather. Northern Lighthouse Board know about it. I've logged it." He took a long drink. "There's a process." "Aye," Hamish agreed pleasantly. "There generally is." He let the silence do its work. Donald stared at his pint. "Thing is," Hamish said after a while, "the light was flickering before the weather got bad. I noticed it this afternoon. Must have been around 3. Donald said nothing, but his hand tightened on the glass. Just want to make sure everything's properly secured up there, Hamish continued, in the tone of a man making casual conversation. What with the coast being what it is tonight, it'd be a dangerous stretch of water without the light. It's fine, Donald said, with the flat certainty of a man who wanted the conversation to end. Hamish nodded thoughtfully and let it end. He was walking back through the lounge when the lights went out. The hotel generator caught after a few seconds, filling the room with a lower, yellower light that made everyone look slightly guilty, which in Hamish's experience was one of the more interesting things emergency lighting could do to a group of people. In the brief darkness there had been a scrape of chairs, a sharp intake of breath from the direction of the window, Clara, he thought, and a sound he couldn't immediately identify from somewhere near the door. When the lights came back, Gregor Sinclair was on his feet. He had his coat in one hand and the expression of a man who had made a decision and was daring the room to question it. He announced, with the volume of someone addressing a meeting rather than a small group in a hotel lounge, that he had matters to attend to, and that he was not the sort of man who sat waiting while other people managed things badly. In this weather, Morag said. She didn't bother to hide her contempt. In any weather, Gregor said, I'll fix matters myself. He left before anyone could respond, letting in a brief violent gust from the hallway as the front door opened and banged shut. The candles on the mantelpiece bent sideways and recovered. The room was quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere above the village and far out toward the headland, the lighthouse beam swung once, twice, and went completely dark. Hamish was already reaching for his jacket. Chapter 3. Death in the Dark. The storm hit its full strength sometime around midnight, and it hit it with enthusiasm. Hamish had gone as far as the edge of the village on foot, torch in hand, before the wind made further progress a negotiation he was unlikely to win. The road to the headland curved north along the shoreline for nearly 2 miles before it climbed to the lighthouse promontory, and in ordinary weather it was a pleasant enough walk with fine views of the water. Tonight the water was making sounds he associated with considerably larger oceans, and the torch beam was being flung sideways by gusts that seemed to come from several directions at once. He made it as far as the small car park at the edge of the village before a particularly forceful argument from the Atlantic persuaded him that pursuing Gregor Sinclair into the darkness was not the productive exercise he had imagined. He went back to the hotel. He told himself that Gregor was a grown man who had made his own decision, and that grown men were allowed to make decisions, even deeply foolish ones, without requiring police intervention. He told himself that the road to the lighthouse was rough and unlit, but not technically dangerous if a person exercised ordinary care. He told himself these things with the persistent reasonableness of a man who did not entirely believe them, and he spent the remainder of the night in the chair nearest the hotel fire, dozing in the way he had learned during Long Highland night shifts, lightly, with one part of his mind always alert. By 4 in the morning the roads had flooded at the lower end of the glen. Hamish knew this because he had tried his radio twice, and reached nothing but static, and then had waded to the edge of the village to confirm what the sound of rushing water had already told him. The single telephone line that served the Lochdoub Hotel had gone down sometime around 3, taking with it his best hope of reaching Strathbane. His mobile showed 1 bar which vanished every time he tried to use it, with the maddening consistency of a bar that existed purely to raise and then destroy hope. Lochdoub was, to employ the technical terminology, cut off. He returned to the hotel, dried his boots by the fire, and waited for morning with the patience of a man who had learned that some situations could not be resolved by action, and could only be resolved by dawn. Dawn, when it came, was grey and exhausted-looking, as though the storm had worn it out. The wind had dropped to something merely unpleasant, and the rain had thinned to the kind of persistent drizzle that Highland weather deployed when it wanted to make a point without further exertion. The loch was still churned and brown-edged, and several branches of considerable size were distributed across the village road with the casual authority of things that had been somewhere else entirely yesterday. Hamish was outside at first light, and it was Angus MacLeod who found the body. Angus had gone out early, as old fishermen did from long habit, regardless of whether they had anywhere to go. He came back into the hotel at 7:30, walking in a way that made Hamish put down his tea and go to meet him before he had spoken a word. There are ways of moving that communicate very clearly, and the way Angus crossed the hotel lobby was one of them. North side of the headland, Angus said, below the lighthouse. You'll want to come. Hamish came, Gregor Sinclair was lying on the rocks at the base of the short cliff that formed the northern edge of the Lighthouse promontory. He was face down, his good coat dark with seawater, one arm extended as though he had been reaching for something that had not been there. The tide had come up around him during the night and receded, leaving his hair plastered flat and his shoes, expensive ones, still precisely laced. It had the look of a man who had gone out in a storm and come to grief on wet rocks in the dark, which was precisely the kind of death that happened on this coastline every several years, and was mourned and talked about and warned against, and then happened again. Hamish stood over the body for a long time without moving, which was not because he was at a loss, but because he was thinking, and thinking was, in his view, very badly underrated as an investigative technique. The first thing he noticed was the head wound. It was on the left temple, partially obscured by the wet hair, and at first glance it was consistent with a fall. The rocks here were sharp and uneven, and a man who slipped in the dark might strike his head on any one of them. But the angle of it troubled Hamish. A man falling forward, which the position of the body suggested would tend to strike the forehead or the right side of the face. A wound on the left temple, dealt with sufficient force to produce the bruising he could see spreading beneath the skin, spoke of something different. It spoke of something coming from the right and slightly behind. The second thing he noticed was the absence of any torch, lantern, or light source of any kind. Gregor had left the hotel in the dark, in a storm, to walk 2 miles of unlit coastal road. He was not, whatever his other qualities, a stupid man. A stupid man would have brought a torch and not used it properly. A man who brought nothing at all had either been in a great hurry, or had expected to meet someone who would provide light, or had not expected to be walking in the dark at all. The third thing he noticed was the ground near the lighthouse door. The lighthouse sat above the cliff on a flat shelf of rock, and the ground immediately in front of the door was sheltered enough by the building's bulk that it had not been entirely scoured clean by the rain. There was soft earth at the margin of the rock, and in that earth, partially blurred by weather but not obliterated, were several sets of marks that spoke of more than one person moving with urgency. A heel print, a long scrape in the earth consistent with something being dragged, or a struggle of feet. A handprint, Hamish thought, though the rain had taken most of it. The lighthouse door itself was closed. Donald had told him last night that it was locked. Hamish tried the handle, and the door opened without resistance. He stood in the doorway and looked at the mechanism inside for a moment, thinking his quiet thoughts. Then he came back out, pulled the door closed carefully behind him, and stood looking down at Gregor Sinclair with the expression his colleague Sergeant McGregor in Strathbane had once described. Not unkindly as his rabbit-down-a-hole face. The roads were flooded, communications were down, forensics, backup, the full procedural machinery of a murder investigation. All of it was somewhere on the other side of impassable water, waiting with its equipment and its forms and its confident modern methods. Hamish had his notebook, a blunt pencil, and 30 years of accumulated knowledge about the way people behaved when they thought nobody was paying attention. He looked back at the hotel, low and yellow-lit against the grey morning. Whoever had done this was in there, drinking tea or pretending to sleep, running through their story and checking it for gaps, doing all the careful, quiet work of a person arranging to be innocent, and they were not going anywhere. Hamish took out his notebook, wrote the time and the date at the top of a fresh page, and began. Chapter 4. No Way Out. There is a particular quality to the silence that falls over a room when someone announces that the man everyone disliked is dead. It is not grief, exactly, though grief may arrive later and in some cases does. It is something closer to the sound of 5 people simultaneously revising their understanding of the situation they are in, and it has a texture that Hamish Macbeth, standing in the doorway of the hotel lounge with his wet jacket and his notebook, had learned to read with some precision. Fiona Drummond went very still. It was the stillness of someone absorbing information and filing it simultaneously, the journalist's reflex, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds before she arranged her expression into something appropriately grave. Dr. Fraser set down his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness of a man ensuring his hands were occupied and controlled. Morag Kerr closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and looked directly at Hamish, which was either the behaviour of an innocent woman or a very confident guilty one. Clara Bell made a small sound and looked at the window, and Hamish noted that she did not look shocked. She looked, if anything, as though something she'd been quietly dreading had arrived at last, and its arrival, however terrible, carried the grim relief of the known over the unknown. Angus MacLeod, who had already known, sat down heavily in the nearest chair and said nothing at all. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually," Hamish said, in the pleasant, unhurried tone that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for simplicity. "Mr. Johnson has been good enough to offer the use of the small dining room. We'll start in half an hour, once you've all had some breakfast. There's nowhere to go this morning, as I imagine you're aware, so we may as well be comfortable." He said this last sentence in a way that was entirely friendly and contained. Nonetheless, the clear message that comfortable was a courtesy being extended and could be withdrawn. He spoke to Morag Kerr first, because she was the one who had argued publicly with Gregor, and would therefore be expecting to be spoken to first, and Hamish found that people who were expecting something tended to have prepared for it, which was itself informative. Morag sat across the small dining room table from him with her hands folded in a manner that suggested discipline rather than calm, and told him that she had confronted Gregor in the hotel corridor at approximately 9:30 after the lights went out. The argument had been about the coastal land he was attempting to acquire, which bordered a protected shoreline habitat that she had spent 3 years documenting and defending. She had told him, with considerable directness, what she thought of his methods, his intentions, and his grasp of environmental legislation. He had told her, with the reflexive contempt of a man who categorized opposition as obstruction, what he thought of hers. "And then?" Hamish asked. "And then I went back to my room," Morag said. "I was angry enough that I didn't trust myself to continue the conversation without saying something I'd regret. Which is not, I want to be clear, the same as doing something I'd regret." "Of course not," Hamish agreed pleasantly. "And you didn't go out at any point during the night?" A brief pause. "No." Hamish wrote something in his notebook that was not, in fact, related to what she had said, but the act of writing it made people believe they had revealed more than they intended, which was occasionally useful. Angus MacLeod came next, settling into the chair with the deliberate economy of a large man in a small space. He had the manner of someone who had decided in advance to tell the truth, which paradoxically made Hamish slightly more alert. People who decided in advance to tell the truth had generally also decided in advance which truths to tell. He had gone out, Angus said, at around 11. He had wanted to check whether the boat he kept moored at the village jetty had weathered the early part of the storm. He had been walking back along the shore road when he saw someone ahead of him, moving in the same direction, toward the headland. "Could you see who it was?" Hamish asked. "Not clearly. The dark was near total, but the height was wrong for Gregor." "Wrong how?" Angus considered. "Shorter, and moving differently. Gregor walked like a man who owns the ground he's on. This person was purposeful but careful, picking their steps." "Man or woman?" Another pause. "Couldn't say for certain. I wouldn't want to say for certain." Hamish thanked him and let him go, and sat for a moment looking at the 2 words he had underlined, shorter and careful. Donald Ross arrived for his interview with the expression of a man who had rehearsed his account so thoroughly that he had begun to find it convincing himself. He sat with his arms crossed, which people believed was defensive, and was actually more often the posture of someone who had made a decision and was holding it in place by main force. The Lighthouse, Donald said, had been experiencing electrical issues for several days. He had reported it to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The malfunction was nothing unusual in advance of severe weather. The door had been locked when he left the building at 6 that evening, and he had the key in his possession. He produced it, setting it on the table between them with the air of someone playing a strong card. Hamish looked at the key thoughtfully. Then he looked at Donald. "The thing is," he said, with the gentle regret of a man delivering unwelcome news, "the door was not locked this morning. I tried it myself at the Lighthouse not an hour ago. It opened without any difficulty." Donald's jaw worked briefly. "The lock's been unreliable. I've logged that as well." "Have you?" Hamish said. It was not a question. He let the silence accumulate for several seconds, then thanked Donald for his time in a tone that made it entirely clear the conversation was paused rather than concluded. Fiona Drummond settled into the chair opposite with the composed efficiency of someone accustomed to being on both sides of interviews. She answered his questions about her movements the previous evening with precision and without elaboration, volunteering nothing and conceding only what was directly asked, which was the behaviour of someone who understood the value of what they were not saying. When he asked what had brought her to Lochdu, she said she was researching a piece on rural coastal development. Gregor Sinclair's developments in particular, Hamish said, a fractional adjustment in her expression, among others. "And were you aware before arriving that Gregor Sinclair would be here this week?" This pause was longer than the others. "I had reason to believe he might be in the area." Hamish wrote something unhurried in his notebook. Outside, the drizzle continued its commentary on Highland October. He asked Fiona 3 more questions about nothing in particular and thanked her, and she left with the slight wariness of someone who had expected to learn what he knew and had not managed it. Dr. Fraser was the last of the 5, and he was, of all of them, the most relaxed, which Hamish filed carefully away under the heading of things that did not add up. He spoke pleasantly about his research into unusual shoreline activity along the headland, shifting substrate patterns, he explained, possibly related to tidal changes, and expressed measured regret about Gregor Sinclair, whom he had barely spoken to. He had spent the previous evening reading in his room. He had heard the storm, but then everyone had heard the storm. Beautiful stretch of coastline, he added with the genuine warmth of a man who meant it. Remarkable, really, what comes and goes along a shoreline like that. Most of it never noticed at all. Aye, said Hamish, looking at him steadily. Most of it. He closed his notebook after Fraser left and sat for a long moment in the small dining room with its smell of toast and damp wool, listening to the sounds of the hotel settling around him. 5 people, 5 accounts, and somewhere in the spaces between them, arranged with varying degrees of craft, was the shape of what had actually happened on that headland. The lighthouse had not simply failed. He was entirely certain of that now. And at least one person in this building had gone out into the storm last night and neglected to mention it. Hamish Macbeth put his notebook in his pocket, went to find Lugs, and took him for a walk in the rain, because walking in the rain was, in his long experience, where most of his best thinking got done. Chapter 5. Fractures in the Group. By midday the rain had achieved the particular steady persistence that suggested it had no intention of stopping and saw no reason to apologise for this. The Glen Road remained impassable at the lower end, a fact confirmed by Mr. Johnson's nephew Robbie, who had attempted it in a Land Rover considerably older and less reliable than Hamish's, and had returned with mud to his axles and a chastened expression. The mobile signal had stabilised briefly at 2 bars, long enough for Hamish to get a voice message through to Strathbane informing them of the situation in the broadest terms, before it collapsed again with the air of something that had never promised otherwise. Loch Dubh was still, in all practical senses, its own small world. The group had reassembled in the lounge after the morning's interviews with the awkward, provisional quality of people who had not chosen each other's company and were now required to endure it indefinitely. Mr. Johnson, who had the Highland hotelier's deep instinct that all social difficulties were best addressed with food, had produced a considerable lunch that nobody ate with much appetite, and was now moving between the kitchen and the lounge with the quiet purposefulness of a man who understood that keeping busy was its own form of order. It was Clara who broke first. She had been sitting across the room from Morag since 11 o'clock, and Hamish had been watching the distance between them the way you watched a barometer, not constantly, but with the periodic attention of someone who understood that the readings would eventually mean something. Clara had the look of a person assembling an argument, sorting and discarding, and Morag had the look of a person who had decided she was not going to be the one to speak first, and was holding to that decision with some effort. At 12:20, Clara set down her teacup, looked at Morag with the directness of someone who had finished being careful, and said that she thought they all deserved to know that Morag had been heard arguing with Gregor on the night he died, and that the argument had been, by every account, a serious one. The room rearranged itself around this statement. "I've already spoken to the constable about that," Morag said, with a steadiness that cost her something. "And I'm sure that was very thorough," Clara said. "I'm simply observing that you had more reason than anyone here to want Gregor Sinclair out of the way, professionally speaking." "Professionally speaking," Morag repeated, in a tone that could have etched glass. "You'd know a great deal about that, would you, given that you've said almost nothing about why you're actually here, and everything you have said seems designed to move attention away from yourself." "I'm writing a novel," Clara said. "You haven't opened that notebook once since you arrived." This was, Hamish noted, accurate. He had been watching. Fiona, who had been regarding this exchange with the expression of a woman filing everything for future use, chose this moment to observe that Gregor had opponents considerably further afield than a single environmental activist. She said it pleasantly and without obvious direction, in the way of someone tossing a stone into water to see where the circles went. They went, as she had perhaps intended, toward Angus. Angus looked up from the fire with the unhurried attention of a man who had been listening carefully to everything, and had been waiting for his name to come up in some form. He said nothing immediately, which was a response Hamish had come to appreciate. The silence itself was informative. not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but of one deciding how much to spend. Gregor's company acquired 3 parcels of coastal land in the past decade, Angus said at last. 2 of them changed hands in circumstances that were disputed at the time and forgotten afterwards, the way those things tend to be. One of the families involved was mine. Nobody in the room made a sound. That's what you call motive, I suppose, Angus continued, with the dry steadiness of someone who had been carrying a thing for a long time and had decided it no longer required concealing. I won't pretend otherwise, but motive and action are different animals, and I've spent 20 years not acting on mine, which I consider a reasonable track record. Hamish, who had been sitting in the corner armchair with his long legs stretched toward the fire and his expression one of benign detachment, made a note. He did not look up while making it, which encouraged people to continue, and they generally did. It was Dr. Fraser who steered things next, with the same easeful subtlety he had shown all morning, suggesting in a few mild sentences that Angus had been out the previous night, that he knew the coastline better than any of them, and that his account of seeing someone heading toward the headland was, he was sure entirely honestly, difficult to verify. Angus looked at Fraser for a long moment. "Aye," he said, "so it is." "I'm only saying that in a situation like this it's worth being thorough," Fraser said pleasantly. "Very public-spirited," Hamish said from his corner, in a tone of warm approval that made Fraser glance over at him with the brief, recalibrating attention of someone who had forgotten he was being observed. The afternoon dragged through its grey hours with the slow accumulation of a Highland afternoon that had nothing to recommend it. Hamish moved through the hotel with the unhurried circuit of a man with no particular destination, which was how he preferred to operate. He spoke to Mr. Johnson about the room arrangements and learned which rooms were adjacent to which. He examined the corridor outside the lounge where Morag had said the confrontation with Gregor had taken place, and found the carpet worn and unremarkable, but noted the position of the emergency light fitting, which was lower than the others and would have cast a particular shadow during the power cut. He found Donald Ross in the small television room at the back of the hotel, not watching the blank screen, and sat with him for 10 minutes without asking him anything at all. Donald bore this with increasing unease, and by the end of the 10 minutes had said, apparently to the middle distance, that the Lighthouse inspection schedules were sometimes adjusted, in practice, to suit operational requirements, and that this was not unusual, and that it was all properly documented somewhere. Hamish said he was sure it was, and thanked him, and left. The fracture, when it came properly, arrived at 3:30 in the form of a sharp cry from the upper corridor. Hamish was at the bottom of the stairs before the sound had finished. Clara Bell was on the landing, pressed against the wall with one hand gripping the banister and the other held flat against her chest, breathing in the shallow, rapid way of someone who had just sustained a shock. The carpet at the top of the stairs was slightly rucked, as though caught by a foot moving quickly, and the emergency light at the far end of the corridor was swinging gently on its fitting in the draught from the stairwell window. "Someone pushed me," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her face had gone the colour of old paper. From behind, at the top of the stairs. Hamish looked at the rucked carpet, the swinging light, the empty corridor behind her. Then he looked at Clara with the careful attention he had been giving her since the previous evening. And what he saw now was something different from the composed performance of a woman on holiday. What he saw now was someone who had been frightened before last night, and was more frightened still, and who was no longer entirely sure that the story she had come to Loch Dubh to find was worth what it was costing her. "Come downstairs," he said, not unkindly, "and then I think it's time you and I had a proper conversation." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and followed him down. Chapter 6. Secret Surface. The small dining room had acquired, over the course of the day, the atmosphere of a place that had seen too many difficult conversations, and was beginning to feel the strain. Mr. Johnson had laid a fresh pot of tea on the table without being asked, which was either Highland hospitality or a man who understood that the constable was going to need something to do with his hands, and possibly both. Clara Bell sat down and looked at the teapot for a moment as though deciding something. Then she looked at Hamish. "How much do you already know?" she asked. It was, Hamish reflected, a more sophisticated opening than he usually received. Most people in her position began with a statement of innocence, and worked backward from there. Clara was beginning with an assessment of the tactical situation, which told him something about her. "Less than I intend to," he said honestly, "but more than yesterday. The two of us filling in the gap between those positions would suit me very well. Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the drizzle continued its indifferent work against the window, and somewhere in the kitchen Mr. Johnson was doing something with pots that suggested dinner was being approached with therapeutic determination. "Gregor Sinclair was my father," Clara said. Hamish did not react visibly, which took a small amount of effort, because this rearranged several things at once. He poured the tea instead, and waited. "Estranged," she added, comprehensively and for a long time. "I want to be clear that I'm not here because I cared about him. I'm here because of what he was doing, and what it was going to cost other people." She had come, she explained, in the careful measured sentences of someone who had rehearsed this but was now departing from the rehearsal, because she'd spent the better part of 2 years watching Gregor's business methods from a distance, and growing steadily convinced that what she was watching was not merely sharp practice, but something considerably worse. She had no legal training, no investigative resources, and no particular standing that would make anyone in authority take her seriously. What she had was Fiona Drummond, who did have those things, and who had been following Gregor's coastal acquisition trail for 18 months through a network of planning applications, shell companies, and unusually accommodating local officials. "Fiona contacted me," Clara said. "She needed someone who could get close to Gregor socially without arousing suspicion. His own daughter, appearing to attempt a reconciliation, was useful." Hamish considered this. "And did he know who you were when you arrived here?" "No. We've not been in the same room in 11 years, and I've changed considerably more than he has. People always do." She paused. "Did." He let that settle before asking his next question. "What exactly were you and Fiona trying to establish?" The pattern that Fiona had uncovered was this. Gregor's company had been acquiring coastal land in several locations along the Northwest Highlands, with a consistency that went beyond ordinary commercial interest in scenic property. The acquisitions were always on remote stretches of coastline, always on headlands or inlets, with limited visibility from the main road, and always, in the period following purchase, quietly fenced in ways that made casual access difficult without technically violating any right-of-way. Planning applications were filed and then withdrawn. Development proceeded in small incremental steps that individually fell below the threshold requiring detailed scrutiny. None of it legal on its face, Clara said. But Fiona found 3 instances where boat activity had been logged by a harbour master's informal records in Ullapool, and the boats involved couldn't be traced to any registered owner, and each instance corresponded to a period when a lighthouse on that stretch of coast had reported unexplained maintenance outages. Hamish put his pen down. He looked at Clara for a long moment, then looked at the wall behind her in the way he sometimes looked at things that weren't there when the shape of something was coming clear. "Donald," he said to himself as much as to her. Clara nodded. "Fiona believes he was paid to allow periodic shutdowns, not long ones, an hour, 2 at most. Enough for an unregistered vessel to navigate a difficult stretch of coastline without the light to make it visible." "And what was the cargo?" "That's what we came here to find out." She picked up her tea and held it with both hands. Gregor was supposed to meet someone this week. Fiona intercepted enough of his communications to know that much. She didn't know who, or exactly when. "We thought if we could be present, if we could document who he met and what was exchanged, we'd have something concrete rather than a chain of circumstantial connections that any competent solicitor could dismantle in an afternoon." Hamish was quiet for a while, doing the kind of arithmetic that had no numbers in it. Gregor had come to Lochdoub for a meeting, not for land. The land interest was real but secondary. It was cover, or it was the legitimate face of something that had an illegitimate interior. The lighthouse at Rudder Moor had been flickering before the storm, Donald had been agitated and evasive about inspections, and someone on a stretch of coast that would have been in near total darkness without the lighthouse beam had met Gregor Sinclair at the base of a cliff and left him there. He went to find Fiona Drummond. She was in the lounge, and to her considerable credit she did not look entirely surprised when Hamish sat down across from her and told her that Clara had given him the outline and that he would now like the detail. She was quiet for a moment, in the evaluating way of a journalist who was also a source deciding how much of herself to hand over. "I should have told you this morning," she said. "Aye," Hamish agreed, without particular accusation. She had, she said, been tracking Gregor's activities for 18 months through documentation alone. The lighthouse shutdown pattern was the most concrete element of what she had found, but it was not the most troubling. The most troubling was a name that appeared in 3 separate sets of records, Always at one remove, always as the facilitating party rather than the principal. A company registered in the Cayman Islands that had no web presence, no stated business purpose, and a single director whose name was shared with a marine biology research institute in Aberdeen. Hamish looked at her steadily. "You'd better tell me the name." "The director," Fiona said, "is listed as E.W. Fraser." The fire shifted in the grate. Hamish looked at it for a moment. He had known there was something wrong with Fraser's ease from the beginning. A visiting academic newly arrived, on a remote stretch of Highland coast in October, comfortable as a man in his own sitting room. He had put it away and kept returning to it, the way you kept returning to a stone in a shoe even after you decided to ignore it. He rose from the chair with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had just decided on the next 3 things he needed to do, and their order. "I'll need everything you have," he said to Fiona, "written down in whatever order it comes, names, dates, references, everything." "You think Fraser killed him?" Fiona said. It was not quite a question. "I think," Hamish said carefully, "that I need to know a great deal more about what's been coming and going along this stretch of coastline before I say anything with any confidence at all." He went out into the corridor and very nearly walked into Angus MacLeod, who had the slightly too casual bearing of someone who had been standing near a door and was now moving away from it at a natural pace. Hamish looked at him. Angus looked back with the expression of a man who knew exactly how this appeared, and had decided that the honest response was to make no effort to improve it. "I've lived on this coastline for 60 years, Angus said quietly. "I know what's been using it, and when, and I've been trying to decide for 2 days what the right thing to do about that is." "And have you decided?" Hamish asked. Angus considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I have," he said. Hamish nodded once. "My notebook's open," he said, and waited. Chapter 7. A Second Incident. Angus MacLeod, it turned out, had been keeping a particular kind of record. Not written down. He was too careful for that, and too old a hand at knowing which things were better kept in the head where they could not be found, subpoenaed, or used against you in ways you hadn't anticipated. But he had been watching the coastline north of Loughdoob for the better part of 18 months, in the way that men who have lost something to the sea tend to watch it, with patience, without sentiment, and without any expectation that it owed them anything in return. He had seen lights on 4 separate occasions, moving along the water between the Rudamore headland and the next inlet north, in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning. Not the lighthouse beam, that was a fixed rotation, as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. These were different lights, lower to the water, intermittent, moving with the purposeful steadiness of a vessel that knew exactly where it was going. On 2 of those 4 occasions the lighthouse beam had been absent for a period of between 40 minutes and an hour and a half. "Did you report it?" Hamish asked. Angus looked at him with the expression of a man who had considered this question carefully and at length. "To who?" he said. "The harbour authority in Ullapool? The Coast Guard? And say what, exactly? That I'd seen lights on the water at night? On a coast where there are boats?" He paused. "I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing before I said anything to anyone, and then I wanted to be sure of who I could say it to." Hamish took this without comment because it was, in the circumstances, a reasonable position, and he had learned over the years that lecturing people about the correct channels was considerably less productive than listening to what they had actually observed. The most recent occasion had been 11 days ago. The lights had moved south along the headland in the early hours, disappeared for approximately 20 minutes in the inlet below the lighthouse promontory, and then reversed course and gone. The following morning, Angus had walked the inlet at low tide and found marks in the shingle consistent with a vessel having been beached there briefly, shallow parallel furrows of the kind a flat-bottomed boat made when it was run up onto gravel in a hurry. He had not disturbed them. He had come back the following day and they were gone, smoothed by the tide. "You said you saw someone heading toward the headland on the night Gregor died," Hamish said. "Shorter than Gregor, moving carefully." "Aye. Was there anything else? Any detail you didn't mention this morning?" Angus was quiet for a moment in the way of a man reviewing a memory rather than constructing one. "There was a light," he said. "Small. A phone screen maybe, or a very small torch. It was on for perhaps 10 seconds and then went off." Hamish thought about this. Which direction was it facing? "Up," Angus said. "Toward the lighthouse." He thanked Angus and sent him back to the lounge and stood in the corridor for a moment, letting everything rearrange itself into a new configuration. Someone had signalled the lighthouse from below, or had been checking their path by the lighthouse beam. or had been confirming something to someone inside. Donald Ross had a great deal more to answer for than a poorly secured door. He found Donald in his room on the first floor, which was technically against no rule, but had the atmosphere of a man putting as much building as possible between himself and the situation downstairs. Donald answered the knock with the wariness of someone who had been expecting it, and was not pleased that the wait was over. Hamish did not sit down this time. He stood in the doorway with the patient solidity of someone who had decided that comfort was no longer the appropriate register, and told Donald, in plain and careful terms, what Angus had seen on the coastline over the past 18 months, and what Fiona's documentation suggested about the Lighthouse shutdown pattern, and what he himself had observed about the door that morning. Donald sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands. The silence went on for long enough that Hamish began to think Donald had decided to say nothing at all, which was his right, and would simply mean that the conversation had a different kind of ending. "I didn't know anyone was going to get killed," Donald said at last to his hands. "Tell me what you did know," Hamish said. What Donald knew was this. He had been approached 8 months ago by a man he knew only as a representative of a marine research organisation that occasionally contracted with Lighthouse authorities for access and logistical support. The arrangement was simple. On certain dates, communicated by text message to a number that Donald had since deleted, he would ensure that the Lighthouse mechanism experienced a temporary malfunction, lasting no more than 2 hours. He would log the malfunction as an electrical fault related to weather conditions. He would ensure the lighthouse door could be accessed from outside by leaving the secondary latch disengaged. He would not be present during these windows. In return, a sum of money had been paid into a savings account held in Donald's wife's maiden name. Donald named the sum, which was not astronomical but was, for a man on a temporary lighthouse keeper's salary, significant. He had not asked what the access was for. He had not asked about the boats. He had told himself, with the particular determination of a man engaged in willful ignorance, that it was probably equipment transfer or survey work, or any one of a dozen legitimate-sounding things that he did not need to think about closely. "And last night," Hamish said. Donald closed his eyes. He had received a message, he said, 2 days before the storm, telling him that the window for the following Tuesday night had been confirmed. He had sent back his acknowledgement. He had done what he always did. He had not expected the storm to be as severe as it was. He had not expected anyone to die. Hamish left him there and went back downstairs, and it was Mr. Johnson who met him at the bottom with the expression of a man delivering news he would have preferred not to possess. "Miss Drummond's notes," Mr. Johnson said. "The notebook she's been writing in since she arrived. She's been looking for it for the past half hour." "And?" "Gone," Mr. Johnson said. "Her room's been turned over as well. Drawers open, bag searched. Whoever it was knew what they were after." Hamish looked at the staircase, then at the corridor that led to the guest rooms, then back at Mr. Johnson. "Who's been upstairs in the last hour?" Mr. Johnson pursed his lips in the manner of a man applying proper Highland discretion to the question of who came and went in his establishment, then released it in the face of a murder investigation. Fraser had gone upstairs at 4:30, he said, citing a headache. He'd come back down 12 minutes later looking entirely free of headaches. Hamish nodded. 12 minutes was enough. More than enough, for a man who knew what he was looking for and where investigators were most likely to have left it. He went to the lounge and counted heads with the automatic habit of someone responsible for a closed group. Morag by the fire, Angus with his pint, Clara in the window seat, Donald, presumably still sitting on the edge of his bed. Fraser was not in the lounge. Hamish went through every room on the ground floor with the brisk, methodical thoroughness of a man who had stopped being patient and started being urgent. He checked the bar, the television room, the small dining room, the lobby, the corridor to the kitchen. He found Fraser in the kitchen doorway, apparently in conversation with Mr. Johnson's nephew Robbie about road conditions, with the relaxed attentiveness of a man who had been there for some time and had nothing particular on his mind. He met Hamish's eyes without flinching, and offered a small, pleasant smile. Hamish smiled back, with equal pleasantness and considerably less warmth, and made a note to keep Fraser in his eyeline for whatever remained of the evening. Clara Bell was in danger, whether she knew it or not, and Hamish was increasingly certain that the person who most needed him looking elsewhere was the one who kept appearing, just slightly too casually, exactly wherever he was not. Chapter 8. The Hidden Connection. There is a moment in every investigation, Hamish had found, when the pieces stop being separate things and become one thing. It was not a dramatic moment as a rule. It did not arrive with any particular announcement. It had the quality, rather, of a word you had been trying to remember suddenly presenting itself in the middle of the night, complete and obvious, making you wonder how you had managed without it for so long. He was sitting with Lugs in the small dining room at 6:30 that evening, the dog's great head resting on his knee with an expression of philosophical solidarity when it arrived. He had spread what he had across the table, his own notes, Fiona's account of the Shell Company, and the name E. W. Fraser that appeared at one remove from 3 separate sets of records, Donald's confession written up in his careful hand, Angus's observations about the coastal lights, and the marks in the shingle. He had been reading through them in the methodical way he read things that were not yielding their meaning readily, which was slowly and without expectation, letting the connections form at their own pace rather than forcing them. What connected Fraser to the smuggling network was the company. What connected the company to the Lighthouse shutdowns was Donald. What connected Donald to the specific dates was a pattern of text messages sent from a number that Donald had deleted, but could, in better circumstances, be recovered by people with the appropriate equipment. What Hamish had been looking for, and what had been sitting in front of him since the morning, was the piece that connected Fraser to Gregor's death, with a particular quality of evidence that went beyond reasonable doubt. He looked at the notes he had taken after a second conversation with Donald, the one where Donald had, with the relieved exhaustion of a man who's been carrying something too heavy for too long, told him everything. The arrangement had been established 8 months ago. The representative who had approached Donald had given no name, only a contact number. The payment had come from an account held by the Marine Research Organisation, the same one whose director appeared in Fiona's records. He looked at what Angus had said about the light signal, small, a phone screen or a very small torch, facing upward toward the lighthouse. He looked at what Clara had told him, that Gregor had come to Lochdu this week because a meeting had been arranged, not a property meeting, something else. And then he looked at the one detail that had been sitting quietly at the edge of everything, waiting for him to give it its proper weight. The fact that Dr. Fraser had arrived in Lochdu on the same day as Gregor Sinclair. Not the day before, not the day after. The same afternoon, in a different car, by a different route, with a completely different stated purpose. 2 men with an undisclosed connection, arriving at the same remote Highland village on the same day, apparently unacquainted. Hamish scratched Lugs behind one ear. Lugs shifted with contentment. He went to find Clara. She was in the lounge, which she had not left since the incident on the stairs, and she had the look of someone who had decided that the safest place was where the most people were. Morag was reading near the fire. Angus had his pint. The lounge had settled into the uneasy but stable arrangement of a group that had run out of accusations for the time being. Hamish sat down beside Clara and spoke quietly enough that the question was for her alone. "Your father's meeting," he said. "The one you and Fiona came here to observe? Do you have any idea what form it was supposed to take?" Clara thought about this with the focused attention of someone whose situation had moved well beyond caution into territory where full disclosure was the only practical option. Fiona believed it was a handover of some kind, she said. Documentation possibly, or payment. Gregor had been using Fraser's network for 2 years, to Fiona's knowledge, perhaps longer. She thought Gregor had decided to restructure the arrangement. He'd been signalling, in the communications she'd seen, that he wanted a larger share. And Fraser's response? She couldn't read it clearly, which worried her. Hamish nodded slowly. A man who had built a profitable criminal enterprise over years, who had managed the logistics with considerable care and left almost no traceable footprint, would not respond calmly to a demand for renegotiation, particularly from a partner who was, by nature, the kind of man who pushed until he found a limit and then pushed past it. Gregor had found Fraser's limit on the rocks below the Rudder Moor headland. He excused himself, told Clara in terms that were pleasant but unambiguous that she was to remain in the lounge until he told her otherwise, and went upstairs. Fraser's room was on the 2nd floor at the end of the corridor, a detail Hamish had established from Mr. Johnson's room plan on the first morning. He stood outside it for a moment, listening, hearing nothing, and then knocked. Fraser answered promptly, which meant he had either been expecting this, or had been awake and dressed, and neither possibility was particularly restful. "Constable," he said, with the welcoming ease of a man who had decided on openness as his strategy, and was committing to it fully. Hamish accepted the implicit invitation and came in. The room was orderly, which was informative in itself. The rooms of innocent people in stressful situations tended toward entropy. Clothes on chairs, toiletries migrating across surfaces, the general entropy of people whose minds were elsewhere. Fraser's room was arranged with the precision of someone who had been thinking about exits. The waterproof jacket on the back of the door was dark green. Angus had not been able to say in the darkness whether the figure moving toward the headland had been male or female, but he had mentioned, in passing, that they moved carefully and were not very tall. Fraser was, Hamish had noted from the beginning, not very tall. He looked at the jacket. Then he looked at the boots beside the wardrobe, which were good walking boots of the serious kind worn by people who spent time on uneven coastal terrain, and which still held, in the deep treads of the soles, traces of reddish mud of precisely the type found on the path to the Lighthouse promontory. "You've been up to the headland recently," Hamish said. "Yesterday morning," Fraser said easily, when the storm had cleared enough to walk. "Research? Before or after we found the body?" A fractional pause. "After, I think. Later in the morning." Hamish looked at the boots again. The mud in the treads was dry and cracked. Not the fresh adherence of a morning walk, but the settled residue of something that had dried thoroughly and then been walked on again. It was the mud of a walk taken some hours prior to the previous morning's grey, damp excursion. "Dr. Fraser," Hamish said, settling into the chair beside the small desk, with the air of a man with considerable time available. "I'd like to talk to you about the E.W. Fraser listed as director of a company registered in the Cayman Islands, which appears in records connected to this coastline, and to Gregor Sinclair's business activities over the past 2 years. The quality of the silence that followed was quite different from the previous ones. It had a different density. It was the silence not of a man composing a response, but of a man doing a rapid and private audit of how much had been found and what remained concealed. "I'm not sure what you mean," Fraser said. Hamish said pleasantly. "That's a natural place to start." He did not produce his notebook. He looked at Fraser with the mild, settled patience that was his most reliable instrument, and waited to see which version of Dr. Ewan Fraser was going to sit across from him for the next portion of the evening. What he saw, in the slight recalibration of Fraser's posture, in the way his fingers adjusted once against his knee and then stilled, was a man concluding that the performance of ease had reached the limit of its usefulness. What happened after that calculation, Hamish understood, could go in one of two directions. The man could talk, or the man could act. He thought about Clara, downstairs in the lounge. He thought about the stolen notebook and the searched room and the incident at the top of the stairs. He thought about the boots with their dried mud and the jacket on the door, and the way Fraser had appeared, slightly too conveniently, in the kitchen doorway that afternoon. A killer who was cornered was a different proposition from a killer who believed himself safe. "I think," Hamish said, rising from the chair with a deliberateness that left no ambiguity about direction, "that it would be best if we continued this downstairs, where there are other people." He held the door open. Fraser, after a moment, walked through it. Hamish followed him and kept him in sight every step of the way down. Chapter 9. The Killer Moves Again. The evening settled over Lochdu with the exhausted quiet of a place that had been through a great deal and was reserving judgment about what came next. The storm's aftermath had left the village tidier than it deserved to be in some respects and considerably worse in others. The main street had been cleared of the larger debris by the combined voluntary effort of several residents who had nothing else to do and found the alternative of sitting indoors with their thoughts less appealing than useful physical labour. The lower road remained impassable, the water having receded far enough to confirm that it had done structural damage to the verge on the western side. The mobile signal had returned with reasonable consistency to 2 bars, which allowed Hamish to make a proper call to Strathbane at 5:30 and speak to Sergeant McGregor at some length. McGregor had received the information about Gregor Sinclair's death and its attendant circumstances with the particular mixture of discomfort and professional duty that characterised him in situations where the comfortable procedures did not apply. He confirmed that roads should be passable by morning at the latest, that forensics and support would be dispatched at first light, and that Hamish was to maintain the situation as it stood, and not, he added with the weary emphasis of long experience, do anything that would make the paperwork worse. Hamish had assured him on this point with complete sincerity, and a privately held definition of worse that had some latitude in it. He had brought Fraser downstairs and settled him in the lounge with the others, and had spent the subsequent hour conducting what he thought of as a holding operation, present enough to prevent anything precipitate, unobtrusive enough to allow the evening to proceed at its own pace while he continued to think. Mr. Johnson produced dinner at 7 with the Highland host's absolute conviction that meals were the correct response to crisis, and the group ate with varying degrees of appetite around the long table in the dining room. Hamish watched Fraser throughout. The man ate well and spoke little, and maintained the relaxed composure of someone who had concluded that the correct response to the current situation was patience. He asked Mr. Johnson about the history of the hotel. He made a mild observation about the weather that produced a civil response from Morag and a silence from everyone else. He did not look at Clara more than briefly, which Hamish noted because a man who was thinking about Clara would work hard not to look at Clara, whereas a man who was not thinking about her at all would glance over as naturally as at anyone else. Fraser was thinking about Clara. After dinner, people distributed themselves in the way of a group that had been too much in each other's company and needed the relief of arrangement without actual separation. Angus returned to the fire. Morag took her book to the far armchair. Donald, who had spent the day in the specific misery of a man who had confessed and was now waiting for the formal consequences, sat in the corridor outside the lounge on a wooden chair and stared at nothing. Fiona settled at the small writing desk by the window, retrieving what notes she had left. She kept a second notebook, smaller, in the inside pocket of her jacket, a professional habit that Fraser had not known about, and wrote with the determined industry of a woman who was not going to let a burgled room stop her from documenting what she knew. Clara said she was tired and was going to bed. Hamish looked at her steadily. "I'll walk up with you," he said. "I'm fine," Clara said, with the reflexive independence of someone who had been managing difficult situations alone for a long time. "Aye," Hamish agreed, "all the same." He saw her to her door, checked the room, and told her to lock the door and not open it to anyone except himself or Mr. Johnson, and that if she heard anything that concerned her, she was to make as much noise as possible immediately and without hesitation. Clara, who had spent the previous 24 hours doing the calculations independently and had arrived at very similar conclusions to his own, accepted these instructions without argument, which told Hamish something about how frightened she actually was beneath the composed exterior. He went back downstairs. Fraser was where he had left him, in the armchair by the window, reading a paperback with the self-contained ease of a man on holiday. The evening passed. 9 o'clock, then past. Hamish drank tea until he was thoroughly tired of tea, and then switched to water. Lugg slept beside the fire, with the wholehearted commitment of a dog who understood that some situations simply required sleeping through, and this was one of them. At 10:15, Fraser said goodnight to the room with pleasant generality and went upstairs. Hamish gave it 3 minutes, which was long enough to be not immediately conspicuous and short enough to matter, and then followed. The upper corridor was empty and quiet. Fraser's door was closed. Hamish stationed himself in the small recess beside the linen cupboard at the corridor's end, which was not comfortable but was largely invisible from either direction, and waited. He had been waiting for 18 minutes, by his watch, when Clara's door opened. She appeared in the corridor in her coat, moving quietly with the muffled urgency of someone responding to an instruction received privately, and Hamish understood in the space of a single second that she had been contacted in a way he had not anticipated. A note slipped under the door, a whisper through the keyhole, something that had told her there was information available, truth to be had, a revelation waiting at the lighthouse if she came now and came alone. He stepped out of the recess as she passed. She startled badly, pressing herself against the wall. "He sent for you," Hamish said quietly. It was not a question. Clara stared at him for a moment, then produced a folded piece of hotel notepaper from her coat pocket, with the look of someone who had known, somewhere, that this was a terrible idea, and had been going anyway because the offer of the truth about her father was a hook she had not been able to resist. The note was brief. It said, "I know what really happened. Meet me at the lighthouse. Come alone. Burn this." Hamish read it, folded it, and put it in his own pocket with the care of a man preserving evidence. "Go back to your room," he told Clara, "and lock the door. This time, do not open it for anyone. Not for me, not for Mr. Johnson, not for anyone at all until morning." Clara looked at him with the wide, measuring attention of someone who was tired of being managed and frightened and kept at the edge of things. "You're going up there yourself." "I am." "That's not safe." "No," Hamish agreed equably. "But there are two of us here, and one of us needs to be somewhere visible and accounted for, and that is considerably more straightforwardly achieved by you than by me." Clara looked at him for another moment, then went back into her room. The lock turned. Hamish went back to his own room, pulled on his jacket and his boots, and looked at Luggs, who had followed him upstairs with the quiet fidelity of a dog who intended to be wherever Hamish was. "Stay," Hamish said. Luggs sat down with an expression of dignified reproach that would have been moving under other circumstances. The great ears were fully deployed, which meant the dog had heard or sensed something that warranted them, and Hamish stood very still for a moment listening. From outside, carried on the last cold breath of the departing storm, came the faint sound of footsteps on the path that led north along the shore. He went out the back of the hotel, keeping the building between himself and the path, and moved through the dark village with the particular quality of Highland silence around him. The lighthouse sat on its headland to the north, and for the first time since the previous evening its beam was turning again, slow, steady, cutting through the remnant cloud in the regular arc that meant the world was, in some basic mechanical sense, working as it should. The path climbed. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. Below him, the loch was calming itself by degrees, the black water returning patch by patch to something like its ordinary character. Ahead, a figure was moving toward the lighthouse door. Hamish moved faster and kept to the shadow of the rocks. Chapter 10. The Light Returns. The path to the Rudder Moor lighthouse was considerably less hospitable in the dark than it had any right to be, and Hamish covered its upper section in a low, quiet crouch that he knew would make his back register a formal complaint in the morning. The rocks were wet, and the grass between them was flattened from the storm into a surface that was essentially polished, and the lighthouse beam swung its patient arc above him every 14 seconds, which was long enough between passes to move and short enough to make you think carefully about where you were when the light came back. He had the figure ahead of him in sight for most of the climb. Fraser moved with the deliberate terrain-reading care that Angus had described seeing the previous night, the gait of a man who knew his way in the dark, who had made this approach before and had established its particular challenges. He did not use a light until he reached the flat shelf of rock at the top, and then he used a small torch, briefly, to find the lighthouse door handle. The door, as Hamish had established that morning, was not locked. Fraser went inside, and the door swung mostly closed behind him. Hamish came up the last section of path at a pace that valued speed over silence, and arrived at the lighthouse door breathing harder than he would have preferred. He pressed himself against the stone wall to the right of it, listening. From inside came a sound that might have been Fraser moving across the floor, and then nothing. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation overhead with the magnificent indifference of machinery that had no investment in the human drama occurring at its base. He pushed the door open and went in. The interior of the lighthouse was a single circular room at ground level, dominated by the iron staircase that spiralled upward to the lamp mechanism above. The room smelled of oil and metal and the particular mineral coldness of stone that the sea had been breathing on for 150 years. Fraser was standing beside the base of the staircase, and he had in his right hand, held with the unremarkable competence of someone for whom it was not a novelty, a length of iron pipe of the kind used in the maintenance of lighthouse fittings, and which would have served at close range in the dark as a perfectly effective weapon. He looked at Hamish with an expression that was not rage, and was not panic, but was the flat, assessing attention of a man conducting a calculation. "You followed me," Fraser said. There was no particular heat in it. It was an observation, the recalibration of a plan. "Aye," Hamish said from the doorway, which he had positioned himself in rather than advancing past, because a doorway was an exit, and an exit was, in the current set of circumstances, a thing he valued. "She was supposed to come." "She's in her room with the door locked," Hamish said. "She'll be there until morning, when the roads will be open and there'll be a considerable number of people coming up from Strathbane with equipment and forms and a very strong interest in what's happened here." Fraser looked at him steadily for several seconds. The pipe was still in his hand, held loosely but not forgotten. "Put that down, Dr. Fraser," Hamish said, in the tone of a man making a reasonable request. "And if I don't?" "Then we have a longer and considerably less comfortable evening," Hamish said, "and the outcome is the same, but it involves more paperwork for both of us." Something in the absolute matter-of-factness of this appeared to register. Fraser looked at the pipe as though mildly surprised to find it still in his hand, and then set it down against the base of the staircase with the deliberateness of a man conceding a point without conceding the argument. Hamish took 3 steps into the room, and no more, keeping the door and the night air at his back. He looked at Fraser, and at the mechanism above, and at the iron staircase, and he said what he had come to say. "You were here 2 nights ago. You came up this path in the dark, the same way you came tonight, and you found Gregor Sinclair at this door. He had come to renegotiate, or to threaten, or to do what men like Gregor did when they felt they had sufficient leverage, which was to demand more than the arrangement allowed for, and you decided that the arrangement needed to end entirely?" Fraser said nothing. His hands were at his sides now, and his face had settled into the careful neutrality of someone who had decided that silence was his remaining option. "You struck him from behind and to the right," Hamish continued. "He fell forward, down the path and over the edge of that low cliff at the north side. Whether you knew he was dead when he went over it, or whether you hoped the fall would account for the injury, I don't know. But you came back down, and you walked back to the hotel in the dark, and you had a headache the following morning and suggested someone else had been out in the night." The lighthouse beam crossed the small high window and moved on. "There's one thing I'd like you to explain," Hamish said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Not harder, but more precise, with the particular quality of a question he already knew the answer to but needed spoken. "When I spoke to everyone yesterday morning, before I had told anyone what condition the lighthouse mechanism was in, you mentioned the internal housing of the beam assembly. You described it as it currently was. A specific fault in the gear mechanism, on the left-hand side of the housing. A detail that would only be apparent to someone who had been inside this building and examined it. Not from outside in the dark, from inside, with a light and enough time to look." Fraser looked at him. "I hadn't mentioned that detail," Hamish said. "Nobody had. I hadn't told anyone what I'd found inside this morning, because I'd only looked briefly through the door and come back to the hotel to speak to the group. You described the mechanism's condition before I revealed what it was." The silence in the room had a different quality now. It was the silence of a conclusion rather than a standoff. "I came inside to disable it," Fraser said at last. He said it with the flat exhaustion of a man releasing something he had been holding for too long. "The night before last, before the storm was fully up, I needed the light down for the window. It was supposed to be routine. And Gregor was here. He'd come early. He wasn't supposed to be here until the window opened." A pause. "He wanted to tell me, face to face, what he intended. He thought it was amusing. He had that quality." "I know," Hamish said, and there was nothing in his voice but the bare acknowledgement of a fact he had assembled from other people's accounts. He took out his handcuffs, which were an object he produced rarely enough that they still had the slightly ceremonial quality of things brought out on important occasions. He told Fraser, clearly and without drama, that he was detaining him on suspicion of the murder of Gregor Sinclair, that he had the right to remain silent, and that in the morning, when the roads were clear and the people from Strathbane arrived, the matter would be placed in the appropriate formal hands. Fraser offered no resistance. He sat on the bottom step of the iron staircase and put his wrists forward with the compliance of a man who had finished calculating and found the numbers did not work. Hamish secured the cuffs, pocketed the key, and sat down against the opposite wall to wait for dawn. It was not entirely comfortable. The stone floor was cold and the room smelled of oil, and there was a draught coming under the door that found the gap between his jacket collar and his neck with unerring accuracy. But the lighthouse beam turned steadily above him, and through the small high window he could see, by degrees, the cloud beginning to separate at the horizon, and the first pale, watercolour suggestion of a sky that was going to be, by all indications, considerably better behaved than its predecessor. At 7:10, with the light growing properly outside and the sound of a vehicle, more than one vehicle, he thought, coming along the road from the south, Hamish heard footsteps on the path. They were followed shortly by a nose, large and grey, appearing around the partially open door, and then by the rest of Lugs, who had apparently concluded that he had stayed where he was told for long enough, and that the situation now warranted his personal assessment. Lugs crossed the room, examined Fraser with the neutral professionalism of a dog conducting due diligence, and then came to sit beside Hamish with his great head pressed against Hamish's knee, and his ears in their full and splendid deployment. "Good dog," Hamish said, which was accurate. Outside, the lighthouse beam made its slow and steady circuit across the brightening water, and down in the village below, Lochdu began, unhurriedly and without fuss, to exhale.